for readers. Writers have always been aware of that. That's part of what it is to be a writer. Maybe the general cultural awareness of that among people who are not writers is heightened now from what it was in the past. That's possible. On the other hand, the internet has provoked people to produce such a flood of unreflective writing. There is so much writing on the internet no one revises and that is simply spontaneously generated that I think there's probably more words published on any day today than at any time in human history. And in that sense, I think the sheer availability of realized language through the internet probably overwhelms any kind of sensitivity that we have. You know, we're literature professors and we think of these things as, we see problems and we see opportunities that probably regular readers don't see quite as clearly as that. And what they see is that there's just a tidal wave of language out there to encounter. I'm always amazed by how much unreflective writing the internet produces. And even, I have to say, even my own. I mean, you know, when I'm writing for the internet, I write very differently than I do when I'm writing a book or an article. You know, there's something about that medium that produces a kind of, your personality is a little different. It produces a kind of spontaneity. It has a kind of invitation to an immediacy that you can't really find anywhere else. And I think, you know, whether it's good or bad, we can't stop it now, but it's certainly a phenomenon that people are going to study in the years to come when they think about the state of the language.
But that it is unreflective, of course, will continue to be a problem. You know.
Yeah, I think it will. Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
Because I read some of your articles on arcade. You know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are spontaneous at some level. I mean, there is that sense of immediacy where you're talking to your readers,
right?
But you're still trying to make a point. You know.
Yes.
But where it is unreflective, I think it causes some social alterations are created,
yeah.
Social ripples.
Yeah.
Because some of those critiques are not founded, I mean.
Oh, that's right.
Very
absolutely.
Unfounded,
that's right. That's right. No, I think the state of the state of things now is an enormous sensitivity to language, but at the same time the enormous availability of so much language to respond to and react to in this immediate, visceral sort of way. So it's probably a cycle that feeds on itself.
Very true. Very true. One more I wanted to it's a more general question. I mean, should we replace comparative literature with world literature? Since the idea of comparison has more often than not meant an unequal relationship between authors or traditions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for example, the example I took was, I mean, we don't compare Mahfouz with R.K. Narayan, for example, but we are more willing to look at something in common between Mahfouz and Faulkner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
so you're observing that comparative literature tends to go through metropolitan areas to make comparisons. That is, that is to say, figures who are from the areas that have been historically comparatively neglected by comparative literature. We don't compare them to each other. We compare them to authors from Europe or the U.S. or something. Yeah. No, I mean, the subject of what world literature means and what the degree to which it's a viable concept in the field of comparative literature is a very lively subject right now, as you know. And I don't take a strong position about it. I'm not particularly either a proponent or an opponent of the idea of world literature. I think I think we don't really know how much good that concept will produce in the years ahead. I think we're watching to see whether it generates the kind of insights that really help us to understand literature. But in terms of the implications of your question, whether we could replace comparative literature with world literature, I don't think that's a matter of a kind of one-to-one replacement. I think the answer is to write a different kind of comparative literature in which everything we talk about does not go through metropolitan places and major languages, and people make an effort to create models for a comparative literature that involves so-called minor literatures and minor languages in dialogue with each other. I think what's needed is a few examples of projects that do that in a very convincing, sort of vivid, original way. And I think it behooves those of us who are old and established in the field of comparative literature to encourage our students and younger people in the field to write that kind of scholarship and give them the incentives to do so. You know, that one of the reasons that people would hesitate to compare an Egyptian with a Latin American without bringing in a European into the conversation is simply that we've created a system of publication and professional advancement in which the incentives to do that are out of whack. And if we had a few prominent examples of this kind of thing, if we gave people a prize for doing the best example of this kind of thing, if we had regular conference events that highlighted this kind of work and called attention to it and validated it, if prominent people in the field talked it up and encouraged people to do it, I think it would change over a period of time. I think young people in this field are always looking for a way to make a mark and do something that would speak better to their interest than the version of the field that they have inherited. And I think that's a natural thing in this field, especially in comparative literature, because it's historically a field that has so much ferment, it's so much aware of its own genealogy and where people in the present stand in relation to the giant figures of the past. So I think there would be an enormous appetite for that, and I think it's up to those of us who are established in the field to encourage it. To me, that's a separate question from whether world literature is a viable concept or not.
One related question actually, that because the politics of identity is such a powerful phenomenon, especially in the past 30 to 40 years, you know, that every group, I mean, consciously believes that it has a right to speak for itself. And things like that, you know, on a very general level. But the level to which they're able to accommodate a marginal presence within their own group has become very minimal actually in the process. Because the ethnic struggles of the past 50 years at least, you know, have made identity such a big thing. My question is that, I mean, ultimately that these will continue to come in the way of any project envisioned through comparative literature, because the demands they are going to make are sometimes unrealistic, and they're too much rooted in that essentialist notion of who they are or what they stand for. You know,
I see.
So therefore, in that context, I think that I mean, what happens to literature as a whole, or literatures in English, or literatures of English, or any of those, I mean, those terms that we use. I mean, how do you look at it? I mean, do you think we can continue to be accommodative, inclusive, where these kinds of politics, you know, I mean, from politicians and other, even intellectuals sometimes, you know, tend to interfere, you know, with these things, with what literature professors try to do, you know. How do you look at it?
I think the default position is to be accommodating. I think there are obviously going to be cases in which, for some reason, according to our best judgment as professionals who work in the field of literary studies, it's possible to be too accommodating, and where we would want to speak up for a narrower conception or something that's more selective. But in general, I think I'm in favor of accommodation. I'm in favor of, I do believe, to the extent that it is a principle, as you say, of identity politics, that we believe that every group gets to speak for itself. I believe that. I believe that all of us need to encourage all groups not to become hegemonic themselves, and not to reproduce the same structures that oppressed them in their own internal politics. And I think it's really important in literary studies that we create and encourage outlets for the kind of scholarship and the kind of criticism and the kind of historical work that gives due attention to every kind of voice and every kind of perspective. You know, it's really vital for the future of our field. So I always feel that the default position is accommodation, and you know, we'll see what happens.
A more general question, you know, your role as a teacher, to what extent it has influenced your research?
That's an interesting question, and I think about it a lot. I've been a professor for a long time. To be honest with you, I have, in all these years, decades, I've never felt I was a particularly talented teacher. I like teaching, like to share my ideas with students. What I don't tend to do is, I'm not very theatrical about teaching, and I'm not very charismatic teacher. I'm sort of businesslike and straightforward about it. And I don't know what it's like in India, but in the American higher education system, there is definitely a downside to being as businesslike as I am. A lot of students just will go elsewhere because they want something that's a little more exciting and a little more dazzling, and I've just never been able to do that. But I do think that if there is something that I get from my teaching that's really important, it is, and that appeals to some students, it is that I use teaching as a sort of laboratory for my ideas, and there really is I bring into the classroom everything I'm thinking about and working on, and this holds true even if I'm teaching a survey course or something that has a fairly prescribed content. I still find ways of bringing my own ideas into the classroom. And my ideas are changed by that. They are inevitably changed. I test them. I will give a class an exaggerated version of one of my arguments without telling them that it's something I'm working on. I will make a parody of my own argument, or I will argue the reverse of something I'm thinking about in order to get a reaction. And I really use it as a place in which I can get responses. And the students, they don't know that I'm doing that necessarily. Often I tell them, but sometimes I don't. But they can tell that what they're hearing is fresh thought. And that to me makes teaching worthwhile. And I think if I retired, I would miss it. I think that part, it infuses my work so much that I look at older colleagues who have retired and I think, but how are they going to get the feedback on the ideas the way that I do? You know, and that's what keeps me going. It has certainly informed my work of the last 10 or 15 years or so. All the projects that we've talked about have been very much informed by this ongoing conversation with my students, undergraduates as well as graduate students. And so I think it speaks to a certain kind of student. It's not wildly popular, but it answers a certain need for them and certainly for me. So that's how I think of the relation between my teaching and my scholarship.
Good. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think being business-like is, in some sense, being impersonal. I think it's a good thing. You know,
I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but I think it's just a reaction to the fact that when I was a student myself, I was at institutions where there were wildly popular teachers who were very theatrical and had what I thought were sort of gimmicks. Memorizing the name of everybody in a 300-person class, that kind of thing. And at the time, I remember as a teenager, 20 years old or whatever I was when I was an undergraduate, I remember thinking, if I'm ever a teacher, I don't want to indulge in those kinds of show business gimmicks, you know? So I've followed that for better or worse, and you know, it's too late to change now. So that's what I. No, honestly, I
keep telling my students, teachers are not film stars. You know, we just have to teach first and make sure you learn something in the classroom.
It's funny because when I was doing some research a couple of years ago into the early 20th century, I encountered some past presidents of the Modern Language Association who in their addresses, presidential addresses, sometime around 1910 or so, would say, well, you know, a generation ago, professors were really serious in the classroom, but now we've become just mere entertainers. And I thought, imagine these dry old philologists in 1910 thought that they were entertainers. So I guess this is a problem that's always been with us.
True. You know, Max Muller said that he did not want to come to India, you know, because he would be disappointed. You know, are you disappointed being here?
Oh no, I love it. I absolutely love it. When I was an undergraduate, I had a kind of unfulfilled intellectual romance with Indian religion. I thought seriously about going to graduate school to study Hinduism and Buddhism. I had a wonderful teacher who was, by the way, not at all a theatrical teacher, but just somebody who gave a kind of intense account of the intellectual problems of those fields. And I seriously thought about it, and of course I went a different way, but all these years I've thought that I wanted to visit India and I wanted to sort of experience it in the present day. And things like Barbara Stoler Miller, all these classics of the classic, obviously I don't read Sanskrit or any modern Indian language, but all the classic works in translation of the poetry of those periods and that great Western tradition of recovering Sanskrit classics and sort of explaining them. Part of me was sad that I never was able to participate in that. So it's in a way a kind of deferred pleasure for me to finally come to India.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.